December 19, 1944. The Ardennes forest lay frozen beneath a white silence broken only by the distant groan of engines. Snow clung to the dark trunks like ash. A single Panzer Rifle sat camouflaged under fir branches, its steel cold enough to sting a gloved hand. Inside, the air smelled of oil, iron, and fear held too long. Hauptmann Ernst Mayr, a decorated German tank ace with victories across Russia and France, adjusted his periscope, scanning the tree line through the dim winter light. He had been told the Americans were retreating, scattered and soft. Yet ahead, faint through the mist, came the low mechanical hum of something familiar yet unnerving. Rhythmic, determined, endless. Then the shapes appeared, Shermans, one after another, rolling through the snow in perfect intervals. They were not sleek, not elegant, not intimidating, but they kept coming. Mayr watched his breath fog against the glass, realizing this was no ordinary engagement. It was a moving wall of steel, a sound of factories echoing across the battlefield. The forest would soon learn that America's power did not ride on fear. It ran on production. By the winter of 1944, the German army was fighting a war its generals no longer believed they could win. The Eastern Front was collapsing under Soviet pressure, and in the West, the Allies had broken through Normandy and advanced deep into France. Hitler's last gamble, Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, the Ardennes offensive, was intended to divide British and American forces, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. The plan depended on surprise, fog, and the endurance of exhausted German tank divisions. Among them were veterans like Ernst Mayr, men who had once driven across Europe in triumph. Their faith rested in the machines that had carried them to glory: the Panther, the Tiger, and the Panzer IV, mechanical symbols of German engineering superiority. To them, the American Sherman was an inferior copy, too light, too thin, too ordinary to challenge their armored spearheads. But the Wehrmacht's calculations overlooked something that could not be measured in armor thickness or gun caliber: volume. Across the Atlantic, the United States had transformed itself into a war machine unlike anything in history. Detroit's auto factories no longer built cars. They produced tanks. By the end of the war, American industry had manufactured over 49,000 M4 Shermans, more tanks than Germany could ever hope to field. While German tankers nursed aging Panthers short on fuel and spare parts, the Americans shipped entire armored divisions across oceans with clockwork precision. The German aces mocked the Sherman, until they met it not as a rival, but as an endless tide. In the Ardennes, the bitter cold favored ambushes. German armor struck first, cutting through thin American lines and reclaiming ground with alarming speed. Propaganda praised the invincible Panzers once more. Yet as snow clogged their tracks and fuel depots ran dry, German confidence began to fade. The enemy they mocked kept returning, one Sherman at a time, repaired, refueled, replaced, like an industrial echo that never stopped. For Mayr and his comrades, the Ardennes would become a revelation. The moment they understood that this war was no longer decided by brilliance or bravery, but by the relentless rhythm of production. In the first weeks of the Ardennes offensive, the fog was thick enough to muffle the sky itself. The Germans used it as cover, advancing through narrow, snow-choked valleys. For a fleeting moment, it felt like 1940 again. Swift armored columns cutting through enemy lines, American soldiers retreating in confusion. In captured outposts, German tank crews found crates of American food: canned peaches, chocolate bars, cigarettes, luxuries unthinkable back home. They laughed, mocking the softness of their enemies, convinced that abundance had made the Americans weak. But that same abundance was precisely what would break them. While the German war economy was strangled by shortages and bombings, the American supply chain had become a force of nature. Each M4 Sherman sent to Europe carried within it the effort of thousands. Welders in Pittsburgh, factory workers in Detroit, women riveters in Chicago, and dockhands in New York loading ships through endless nights. Every shell, every track, every gallon of fuel represented the synchronized heartbeat of an entire nation. The Sherman itself was not a perfect tank. Its armor was modest, and its 75mm gun often struggled against the front plate of a Panther or Tiger. But the Sherman's true advantage lay in something invisible: logistical immortality. When one burned, another was already en route. When a gun jammed, a replacement part was waiting. When a crew was lost, fresh soldiers took their place within days. German crews like Meyer's realized too late that they were not fighting a single machine, they were fighting the American system. Captured reports from German officers during the battle revealed disbelief at the Americans' resilience. One wrote, "We destroy one column, and by morning, another appears in its place." Others noted that American tanks seemed to multiply overnight, their broken hulls repaired before dawn, their fuel never running out. By Christmas 1944, the offensive had slowed. Panthers lay abandoned in ditches, their crews shivering inside empty shells of steel. The Americans kept advancing, their engines humming like a distant assembly line rolling across Europe. For men like Ernst Mayr, the realization was bitter. The enemy he had once mocked for cowardice was not driven by fear or desperation. They fought with an invisible army: the workers, the factories, the engineers, and their weapon was abundance itself. The Battle of the Bulge revealed more than tactical maneuvers. It exposed the contrasting souls of two war machines. On one side, Germany fought with precision, pride, and dwindling resources. On the other, America fought with rhythm, an industrial pulse that never seemed to tire. From the German viewpoint, the Ardennes had been chosen for its secrecy. Dense forests, narrow roads, and poor weather offered an advantage to ambush tactics. The Panzer crews were confident. They had survived Kursk, Normandy, and countless retreats. Many believed that if they struck hard enough, the Western Allies might fracture. The first days seemed to confirm this. American outposts fell quickly. Whole units surrendered. Convoys burned on frozen roads. But then came the Shermans. At first, they appeared clumsy, too exposed, their armor glistening with frost. German commanders scoffed at their boxy silhouettes, calling them Tommy Cookers. Yet, the Americans fought differently. When a Sherman was hit, another took its place. When a road was blocked, bulldozers cleared it. When fuel ran low, engineers built new pipelines overnight. German tankers, used to scarcity, could not comprehend how the enemy always seemed ready for another assault. To Mayr, each new wave of Shermans sounded like an assembly line approaching from the woods. He later described in his field notes, "We struck one down, but 5 came forward." The snow was filled with the hum of engines that would not die. From the American side, the Ardennes was chaos wrapped in ice. The 4th and 9th Armored Divisions fought against overwhelming odds, often outgunned. Yet they adapted fast. The Sherman's simple design allowed field repairs that German crews could only dream of. American soldiers would strip damaged tanks for parts under shell fire, reassembling them by dawn. Each Sherman that returned to the line was a testament to America's industrial philosophy. No machine was sacred. Only function mattered. The psychological difference between the two sides was stark. German tankers were craftsmen, proud of their machines as masterpieces of engineering. Americans were pragmatists. To them, a tank was a tool. It did not need to be beautiful. It needed to work. That difference defined the war. Even as German aces like Mayr struck dozens of kills, they knew they were running out of fuel, ammunition, and time. Each Panther lost was irreplaceable. Each Sherman lost was a line item in a vast industrial ledger already replenished across the sea. The Sherman's hum became the sound of inevitability, the steady drumbeat of a nation that built not just to fight, but to endure. As the snow deepened in late December 1944, the contrast between the two armies grew sharper. The German tank aces who once ruled Europe now fought with the desperation of hunters turned prey. Their panzers were superior in single combat. Better armor, greater firepower, more precision. But superiority meant little when the battlefield itself became a factory floor. In captured American positions, German soldiers found strange symbols of comfort: stacks of canned food, warm wool blankets, Even Christmas rations labeled U.S. Army, packed with care. These discoveries astonished them. One officer wrote in disbelief, "The Americans live as if the war does not touch them." For soldiers who survived on bread and cold coffee, the sight of chocolate and cigarettes felt surreal. It was as if the Americans had imported a small piece of their homeland into the front line. That abundance became symbolic. The tin can, a simple container of food, stood as the quiet emblem of American power. It represented not greed, but capacity. The ability to feed, clothe, and move an army across continents while fighting on multiple fronts. For every German soldier shivering in the Ardennes, there was an American one opening a can of beans beside a warm tank engine. Tactically, the Sherman had another hidden strength: communication. Each M4 carried radios, allowing real-time coordination between tanks and infantry. German crews, constrained by limited sets and static command channels, fought blind by comparison. What the Americans lacked in armor they made up for in awareness. In the dense forests, that difference was lethal. Logistics also turned the tide. American engineers built makeshift bridges across frozen rivers, cleared wrecks with cranes, and laid down supply depots in hours. Fuel trucks moved under constant fire. The entire system moved like a living organism, each part feeding the next. For the Germans, this was an alien concept: war as an industrial process. By early January 1945, Meyer's battalion had lost half its tanks. Those still running were low on ammunition and fuel. In his final report from the Ardennes, he wrote, "Our enemy fights with the certainty of replacement. We fight with the memory of what cannot be replaced." The Sherman was no longer just a tank. It was the physical manifestation of an idea that the power of a free people working together could outlast even the most advanced war machine. And as the smoke cleared from the snow-choked valleys, that idea was no longer theory. It was victory taking form in steel. January 3, 1945. The snow turned to slush as temperatures rose above freezing. The Ardennes forest, once silent and still, had become a graveyard of metal. Panthers lay twisted and blackened in ditches. Abandoned half-tracks lined the roads like broken ribs. The German advance had ground to a halt. In the hills near Bastogne, Ernst Mayer's Panzer IV stood among the last operational tanks in his company. Its once clean armor was streaked with soot and ice. The crew hadn't eaten properly in 2 days, and their last fuel drums were nearly empty. Through his periscope, Meyer could see them. The Shermans again. Not one or two, but dozens. They came not as hunters, but as a formation, an organized mechanical rhythm. The engines droned with an unending steadiness that chilled him more than the cold. Meyer's gunner loaded the last high-velocity shell. He aimed and fired. A Sherman erupted in flame. Yet before the smoke cleared, another rolled through, treads crushing snow and steel alike. There was no pause, no hesitation, no fear. Reports from German Field Command described the same pattern across the front. The American counterattack was relentless. What had begun as a surprise German assault had turned into a rolling wave of American armor pushing back with industrial precision. The 3rd and 9th Armored Divisions led the charge, supported by endless supply convoys and artillery fire that darkened the horizon. For Meyer, the moment of realization came not in defeat, but in observation. Watching the line of Shermans move with clockwork regularity, he understood that Germany's technological brilliance had been overtaken by something far greater: industrial democracy. Every Sherman on that road was a promise fulfilled by a factory worker thousands of miles away. Every shell that landed came from a machine pressed into service by a nation united in purpose. When his tank finally ran dry, Meyer ordered it abandoned. He and his men trudged through the melting snow, passing wreck after wreck, German, American, indistinguishable now under soot and frost. Above the horizon, the sound of engines continued. A constant hum, distant but endless. It was the sound of America's war machine, not driven by conquest, but by commitment, an orchestra of factories, workers, and willpower that refused to stop. As the battle line shifted, The true turning point came not from one tank duel or ambush, but from exhaustion, the collapse of Germany's ability to sustain its own brilliance. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last gamble, had demanded more fuel than the Reich could produce. Panther and Tiger tanks stood immobile in forests, abandoned not by cowardice, but by mathematics. Meanwhile, American convoys crossed the Meuse River like veins of iron. Endless columns of trucks, GMCs, Dodges, and Jeeps, streamed west to east, each carrying crates of fuel, ammunition, and rations. The Shermans never ran dry, their crews never ran hungry, and when one fell, 3 more took its place. For the German tank ace, Ernst Mayr, it was as if the battlefield itself had turned into an assembly line. He had spent years perfecting marksmanship, gunnery, and maneuver, but those skills no longer decided the outcome. It was decided far from the front, in Detroit, in Pittsburgh, in Chicago. Archival records from the U.S. War Production Board confirm this. By late 1944, American factories were producing nearly 2,000 tanks a month. For every Panther Germany built, the United States rolled out 5 Shermans. Even with thinner armor and a less powerful gun, the Sherman's advantage lay in ubiquity. It was everywhere, and always ready. Mayr once scoffed at reports that the Americans dropped chocolate with their rations, that their soldiers received cigarettes, coffee, even fresh bread. Yet now, as his crew scavenged frozen potatoes from an abandoned Belgian farm, those stories felt less like propaganda and more like a reflection of something profound, a system that valued morale as much as machinery. The sound of the American engines became the symbol of inevitability, a low, rhythmic growl that filled the valleys long after gunfire ceased. That sound meant fuel. It meant food. It meant another wave of replacements, another line of tanks cresting the ridge. By January's end, the Ardennes campaign was lost. German commanders issued retreat orders through broken radios. Mayr looked once more toward the distant rumble, not with hatred but with a grim, almost academic respect. The Americans had shown him something no classroom in the Panzerwaffe ever taught, that wars are not won by fear or ideology alone. They are won by systems that feed their soldiers and fuel their steel. As he withdrew eastward, the sound of those engines faded, but never left his mind. When the snow melted across the Ardennes, the scale of the collapse became visible. What the Wehrmacht called Rückzug, withdrawal, was, in reality, the slow unraveling of a war machine once considered unstoppable. Dozens of tanks, once the pride of Germany's armored divisions, lay half-buried in mud and snowdrifts, their engines seized from cold and lack of fuel. The M4 Sherman, however, kept advancing, not just as a tank, but as a symbol of American persistence. Its crews were young, often inexperienced, yet their machines arrived faster than the Germans could destroy them. The U.S. Army's supply chain, stretching from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Belgium, worked with industrial precision. A tank damaged on Monday could be replaced by Thursday. Fuel convoys ran like clockwork. Maintenance units operated like pit crews of democracy. Captured German reports from January 1945 tell the same story. Officers noted, enemy armored forces maintained constant momentum regardless of losses. To them, it was incomprehensible. A military that measured power not by individual skill, but by collective production, Ernst Mayr was eventually reassigned to defend the Rhine, commanding what remained of his Panzer company. Of his original crew, only 2 survived. Their Tiger tank, once the apex predator of Europe's battlefields, was abandoned after running out of fuel near Remagen. There, Mayr witnessed something no German soldier had expected: the Americans building a bridge faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy it. He watched through binoculars as the U.S. engineers worked, hundreds of men in synchronized motion, laying steel panels, guiding trucks across within hours. It was a feat of logistics as breathtaking as any victory on the field. Mayr later wrote in his journal, "They fight not with one army, but with 1,000 factories behind each soldier." For many German veterans, that realization was the quiet end of the war. Not when Berlin fell, but when they understood the impossible scale of what they faced. The Americans had turned production into strategy, efficiency into power. By spring 1945, Meyer's war was over. His tank lay rusting beside the Rhine, while the Shermans rolled forward toward victory. Not because they were stronger, but because they never stopped coming. In the months that followed, Europe became a graveyard of steel. The twisted hulks of Tiger and Panther tanks dotted the countryside like monuments to a vanished empire. Farmers would later plow around their carcasses, the blackened remains of once feared machines rusting quietly under the open sky. When Allied investigators arrived to assess the aftermath, they were astonished by what they found. German tank crews often lacked even the simplest repair parts, relying on scavenged bolts and fuel filters stripped from destroyed vehicles. In contrast, American depots overflowed with supplies, rows of new engines, replacement tracks, even spare uniforms, all waiting in orderly stacks. This industrial rhythm, more than any single weapon, had crushed the German dream of armored dominance. Where the Reich relied on precision craftsmanship, the United States relied on repeatable perfection, a philosophy born in Detroit's assembly lines and perfected under wartime urgency. Former German officers would later admit that what terrified them most wasn't the Shermans, armor or gun. It was its numbers, the knowledge that behind every tank destroyed, another 10 were already on trains headed for the front. One post-war report called it a tide that could not be contained. Ernst Mayr was captured in late March 1945 near Koblenz. By then, his hands were burned from handling overheated gun barrels, his uniform tattered and smoke-stained. When he was processed by American MPs, he noticed something strange. The food. Soldiers on guard duty were eating canned fruit, white bread, and steaming coffee. Luxuries he hadn't seen since 1939. That moment, more than defeat itself, marked the breaking point. The Americans' abundance, their effortless access to comfort amid destruction, was the ultimate display of power. For Mayr, the sight of a simple loaf of bread became the symbol of how differently these two nations had waged war. Months later, in a POW camp, he wrote, "They conquered us not with hate, but with hunger satisfied." The ruins of the Reich would fade, but the lesson endured. Industrial democracy had proven stronger than militarized ideology. The Tiger might have been superior on paper, but the Sherman, multiplied 1,000-fold, was the true engine of victory. The war ended not with a single explosion, but with a quiet understanding. Across the battlefields of Europe, silence replaced the thunder of engines, and soldiers, once enemies, began to comprehend what the conflict had truly revealed. For men like Ernst Mayr, the greatest shock was not defeat in combat, but the realization that war could be fought as an act of organization rather than fury. The Americans had transformed their factories into arsenals, their workers into soldiers without rifles, and their machinery into a living organism of production. Every bolt, every rivet, every track link represented a choice, to overwhelm not through cruelty, but through constancy. The symbol that remained in Mayr's mind was not the roar of a tank, but the sound of it, that endless mechanical heartbeat echoing through the Ardennes. To him, it was the rhythm of a nation that believed in abundance, not domination. In the years after the war, Mayr would tell his grandchildren that he once fought against a country that seemed to manufacture hope. He would speak not of hatred, but of awe, of men who carried chocolate in their pockets and wrote letters home on paper smelling faintly of engine oil. America's victory, in the end, was not just measured in tanks or tons of steel, but in the idea that freedom itself could be mass-produced. The Sherman was never the strongest, nor the most elegant, but it was enough, because there were enough of them, driven by enough hands, under a flag that stood for something more than conquest. And so the sound of that factory-born machine rolling through snow became more than a memory of battle. It became a lesson whispered across generations, that power sustained by humanity, by creation rather than destruction, is the kind that endures. For every empire built on fear eventually rusts. But those built on the courage to build never do.